All of you Americans of Japanese descent have a right to be proud today. You have demonstrated true Americanism and true American citizenship on the field of battle. You have realized the necessity of coming to this distant land and leaving your homes and your loved ones in order that you could destroy this enemy who would take from you the American way of life and the freedoms which we value so highly in America.
In 1943, 10,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry volunteered to serve in the United States Army. They came from the territory of Hawaii and they came from the mainland, many answering the call from behind the barbed wire confines of relocation centers. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team was the result of this volunteer effort, an all-Nisei unit that eventually joined the Allied campaigns in Italy and France. In March of 1945, the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion, a unit of the 100th 442nd, was detached from the combat team and sent across the Rhine for the final push into Germany. There they were among the first Allied liberators to discover the Nazi atrocities committed in the concentration camps known collectively as Dachau.
Well, the basic reason, of course, for volunteering to the combat team was to establish our loyalty, to establish a basis for our returning to a free community after things got back to normal.
We were brought up listening to Japanese samurai stories where father and son would be on opposite sides, or brother and brother would be on opposite sides, you know. And many of us who volunteered for service, when we got into the Army, it was already with the full knowledge and determination that we were going to die, you know.
The Americans of Japanese Ancestry, or AJAs, that served in the Second World War were primarily Nisei, or second generation. Some 33,000 AJAs served in one of 4 U.S. Army groups. The 100th Infantry Battalion was formed in the spring of 1942. A year later, the call went out for volunteers into the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. The 1399th Engineer Construction Battalion served in Hawaii during the war, while men of the Military Intelligence Service, or MIS, served as interpreters in the Pacific Theater. The 522nd Field Artillery Battalion, a part of the 100th 442nd, was the only Nisei unit to fight in the battle for Germany. In May of 1992, some members of the 522nd returned to Dachau, Germany, where 46 years earlier they were among the liberators.
From the fence I could see about 30 feet inside, 30 to 50 feet inside. That's where I seen this.
But there were dead bodies in there?
No, these prisoners was walking around.
Oh, they're still walking around?
Yeah, all skinny and...
So the stench, the smell was so bad. It's, you know that they lived an awful life before the extermination.
I think there's a certain irony in that for a minority to liberate another minority group.
You know, we have to go back to the many years before Pearl Harbor. Even in the late 1800s, when the predominant labor force here in Hawaii were Japanese immigrants brought over to work the plantation.
My parents came to Hawaii way back in about 1910. My dad was a Japanese school principal, and the plantation's Japanese community needed Japanese school teachers.
Americans of Japanese ancestry, Filipino ancestry, Korean, Chinese, Hawaiian, Portuguese, Puerto Rican. At the lower levels, we were all very even, I would say. We got along well. But I think at the higher levels, maybe there was some subtle discrimination, because you didn't see any non-Caucasian in any position of responsibility.
By the 1940s, Asian diversity in Hawaii represented a labor force crucial to the island's economy. But in the western United States, a growing Japanese immigration was seen as a threat to the very existence of Anglo life. Indeed, a 1921 statement to the Senate declared the Japanese to be an unassimilable race, unfit for U.S. citizenship. The early part of the century was filled with yellow peril propaganda and political maneuvering in the name of anti-Japanese legislation.
After high school, when I first went up to the University of Washington to register, one thing that I've never forgotten is that as we went through the rigmarole of signing up, getting in various lines, at one point I was somewhat brusquely pulled out of one line and told, here, this is the line you should be in. What's that other line for then? Oh, you're not eligible for ROTC, so you can't be in that line. Not so much that I wanted to be in that course, but just the fact that I was selected as being not eligible, naturally with the racial overtones involved, particularly being of Japanese ancestry. That did hurt, and I've never quite forgotten that, you might say.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
A fellow worker that used to work for me told me Japan is going to come and bomb Pearl Harbor one of these days. And I thought, mister, you got that all wrong.
So somebody yelled and said, hey, the battleship is on fire. And that's the first time any battleship was on fire, so we all ran down to the camp highway and sat on the fence over there. And between our sitting there and the Arizona burning, there was only open water and the railroad track below it. So
the bus station was right in front of the Waipahu movie theater. And while I was waiting for the bus, I heard airplane and machine gun fire coming close by. And then as I looked up, and I saw this rising sun insignia on that plane. I said, oh no, Japan is attacking us, you know.
That afternoon, the governor commissioned the whole ROTC into the Hawaii Territorial Guard. And so we became part of what would be the same as a state militia.
We never fired a rifle, but on December 7, because we were in the ROTC, they called us out very early, you know, right after we noticed the bombs falling and the radio blaring, you know, take cover. This is the real McCoy.
Within a few hours of the attack, the territory was put under martial law. Civil rights were suspended as authorities began rounding up those perceived to have close ties to the Japanese government or to be perpetuating Japanese culture. Yet AJA members of the ROTC found themselves guarding important installations on Oahu.
I remember I was posted in downtown Honolulu right in front of the main library. And we were told to challenge every person who comes by us, you know, halt them, let them identify themselves, and we did this all night long, you know. Many of them in responding, you know, they were shaking. I don't know what their thoughts were. It was incredible that a tiny country like Japan would take on, you know, a country like ours, the United States, you know. And it took a good long while, I think, for the full impact to sink in.
The attack on Pearl Harbor united Americans as never before in history. In the explosions at Pearl Harbor, there was forged the will for complete and absolute victory over the forces of evil.
After getting over the initial shock and anger that the Japanese would do a thing like this, the big concern that bothered all of us was we were on the spot.
I saw those red Japan planes. I was somewhat disturbed and concerned about our own welfare and my own welfare, what they're going to do to us.
The propaganda war had also begun. The FBI version of the forces of evil included not only agents of Japan, but all aliens on the West Coast and Hawaii.
Many members of illegal Jap societies, all born in Nippon. They'll do no fifth columning where they're going.
First thing after the war started, during the day, some military type people came and picked him up and took him away. My dad and in his category were considered prisoners of war.
Particularly the FBI and the military intelligence did detain certain individuals that were considered security risks.
At night, you know, they used to evacuate all the local teachers, ministers, recent returnees from Japan. They load them on a ship at night.
In Wailuku, there used to be a prison, and they were all put in there, and then shortly thereafter shipped out to Honolulu, Sand Island.
The imprisonment of Japanese perceived as perpetuating Japanese culture or having close ties to the emperor did little to calm the tide of suspicion in Hawaii. Japanese American workers were required to wear black badges of identification, and rumors of sabotage abounded, where in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, many important installations were protected by AJA members of the Hawaii Territorial Guard.
After 6 weeks, somebody in Washington, D.C., the War Department, suddenly discovered, I guess to their great horror, that here was Oahu guarded by hundreds of Japanese kids that were in uniform and were armed. And so everyone of Japanese ancestry in the Hawaii Territorial Guard was honorably discharged. And I remember the date. It was January 19th, 1942. You know, it was like the bottom of my life had dropped out. It never occurred to me, anyway, that here I was born, raised, educated in America, and yet my own country would suspect, question, and even reject me in this time of need when it needed every able-bodied man to serve or defend the country.
Mad, yes. Mad, oh, there's that. But It was the idea of what can we do next for most of us. So, like some of the university students, they formed what was then known as the Vaste Victory Volunteers a few months later.
The country needed every available man, whether it was with a gun or with a pick and shovel. So we volunteered as a labor battalion. And about 160 ex-HTG students at the UH volunteered to the military governor. We petitioned and said, use us in any way you see fit, and he accepted our petition.
Even as the volunteers in Hawaii began digging ditches for their country, Japanese on the mainland prepared for mass evacuation. President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942. The order suggested military necessity as justification for the removal of any or all persons from designated military areas. Though the actual order did not mention the word Japanese, it was applied only to people of Japanese ancestry and was implemented by Commander of the Western Defense, Lieutenant General John DeWitt, whose belief it was that a Jap is a Jap.
It was our good fortune that we were not treated in the same manner as they were on the mainland. Of course, I'm an engineer, so I can appreciate all the logistics that would have been involved if they tried to move a population as huge as ours over water,
In other words, cool heads prevailed, and they were deemed too essential to the economic and social stability of Hawaii, which was not, of course, the story in the West Coast United States.
We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous. But no one knew what would happen among this concentrated population if Japanese forces should try to invade our shores. Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move.
It was just publicly posted, as I recall. And, well, the Japanese American Citizens League was active even in the pre-war years. And our leaders in that organization told us that it was our part at that point in the war effort to comply, and we basically left home, with that attitude.
Neither the Army nor the War Relocation Authority relished the idea of taking men, women, and children from their homes, their shops, and their farms. So the military and civilian agencies alike determined to do the job as a democracy should, with real consideration for the people involved.
Given, I think, 48-hour notice when the evacuation order came to sell everything or get rid of everything and carry only bring what you could in a suitcase.
2/3 of the evacuees are American citizens by right of birth. The rest are their Japanese-born parents and grandparents. The people are not under suspicion. They are not prisoners. They are not internees. They are merely dislocated people, the unwounded casualties of war.
Then they were herded into Santa Anita in an assembly center and then shipped off to one of the 10 or 12 relocation camps that were established in the interior of the United States.
I had always thought, why only the AJAs were, rounded up? Why not the German Americans or the Italian Americans? Because they were in the same war too.
By the spring of 1942, the German Wehrmacht had overrun much of Central Europe with Hitler's lightning war. Using political trickery and the overwhelming firepower of a rebuilt army, Hitler vigorously sought to recover territory lost from Germany under the Treaty of Versailles. The Third Reich was now poised to threaten an entire continent with supreme military might, and a racist agenda based on Hitler's theories of Aryan superiority. Adolf Hitler had come to power in a Germany humiliated and racked with inflation after its defeat in World War I. It was the perfect breeding ground for a totalitarian ideology with an anti-Semitic doctrine at its core.
The Nazis had organized a parade, and it would be dangerous for me to come home just with my sister. And I remember the parade. I watched it from the apartment window with the swastika banners and the men in uniform and the drums pounding. You can still hear the drums. And I remember the signs. Juden sind hier nicht erwünscht. Juden dürfen hier nicht kaufen. Juden raus, this and that. No Jews can buy here. Jews get out. That was the mild part.
Every morning in the auditorium they sang these songs, Heil Hitler, sharpen the knives to let the blood of the Jews flow freely, and similar songs. We were then excused, my sister and I, from the assemblies, which were the morning ritual, and shortly thereafter we were not allowed to go to school anymore as Jews.
A new kind of hatred had emerged in these early years of Nazi Germany. A hatred now sanctioned by Hitler's National Socialist Party and easily manipulated in an environment of newfound prosperity. And with propaganda as a Nazi chief conspirator, the persecution of European Jewry escalated. In the face of imminent massacre, what was perceived by some as a strange passivity was rather the disbelief of a people caught between the barbarity of Nazism and the indifference of observers.
You can't just leave a place, you have to have a place to go to. It's a question of survival. How do you make a living? Where will people give you a chance? The Prime Minister of Canada at that time, when asked how many Jewish refugees he would accept, said, even one would be too many.
A Polish Jew named Greenspan had assassinated one of the members of the German embassy. And the Germans used that as a pretext for the so-called Reichskristallnacht, which was the night where they burned all the synagogues, smashed all the Jewish shops, arrested a lot of people and sent them to concentration camps. It was the first roundup for concentration camps of any large magnitude.
In America, Hitler was Time magazine's Man of the Year for 1938. By 1943, millions of Jews and others had already been murdered in German concentration camps. This was well known among the Allies, but not a murmur from Roosevelt. He had a war to win, and on the verge of heavy U.S. commitment to the European theater, the administration now considered the formation of a Japanese-American fighting unit. Though thousands were locked up on the mainland or stripped of duty in Hawaii, and all Nisei were listed as 4C, draft ineligible, it was thought the enlistment of 5,000 or so Nisei would both grant the wishes of those desperately wanting to prove their loyalty, as well as strengthening U.S. forces.
So the original plan was to call for 3,500 volunteers from all the camps on the mainland and 1,500 from Hawaii. And when they call out for volunteers, 10,000 volunteered from Hawaii, and there were just a handful from the relocation centers.
When the call came out, I noticed we all figured that we were more or less on the spot to volunteer. If we didn't make a good showing, we would bring, kind of shame to the, not only the family, but to the Japanese people as a whole in Hawaii.
I saw many grown men who tried to get in and were rejected, crying that time, many of them. So the 442nd who actually, were picked were really the cream of the crop, you might say.
The day that we left there, we boarded the 6x6 truck, and Mom said that she was not gonna see me off because if she did, that she won't be able to hold back her tears. She went down there anyway, downtown, and hid behind a building, and she saw us leaving But when she got home, she said she went into her room and had a good cry.
In April 1943, the volunteers from Hawaii arrived at Camp Shelby, Mississippi for training. Most had never before been off the islands, and the pidgin English they spoke was in sharp contrast to the English of their mainland counterparts.
I started off as any other buck private, you know, and in the artillery, when we got to Camp Shelby, we found that the TO was all practically filled up, you know. Anything above buck sergeant was filled already by a mainland cadre. These are mainland Niseis. They were our cadre.
And what was going on was that actually a lot of the mainland boys were pulling rank. And that's where we had a lot of fights, actual fights between mainland Niseis and Hawaii Niseis.
While Hawaii and mainland AJAs made up the lower ranks of the regiment, the Army selected Caucasian officers to train the unit, which was to be under the command of Colonel Charles Pence.
He informed us of the unit that we were in, the duties of it, and what we were going to do, and that we were going to really work and train. And if we didn't like it, he said, I don't want a man in this unit that has one doubt about any man in it. I know of at least a dozen officers were sending on assignment that left there. When you said Japanese American, to them that meant nothing. All they heard was the Japanese part, I would imagine, and thinking about Japan, they didn't want anything to do with this. They didn't know what it was. They'd never heard of it. In fact, not many people in the United States, part of our own government, hadn't heard of this unit when it was formed.
A lot of times we felt, gee, why did we volunteer, you know? But at the end, we're kind of glad that we did, and we're among friends, knowing that we're going to fight together.
When we were in Shelby, and we do go to Harrisburg or some other town, the way they look at us, they think we were some kind of an animal looking in. You know, when you go to the zoo, behind the cage, they look at you, you're in a restaurant, you cannot eat peacefully with these people staring at you.
Passing any white man or groups of white men, they would give us a glare or stare and just say Japs, you know.
The unsettling patterns of discrimination and second-class citizenship that dogged the AJAs could hardly have prepared them for the disturbing segregation policies of the southern United States. They saw black soldiers in uniform kicked off buses, and white versus colored restrooms confused the AJAs, who were uncertain as to which they should use. But north of Shelby, in the relocation centers of Rahr and Jerome, Arkansas, there was no need for segregated facilities, and visiting Hawaii Nisei soldiers took the opportunity to see firsthand what was happening to people of Japanese ancestry.
Busloads of us went to both camps, Rahr and Jerome. On four corners of the camp were machine gun posts with manned machine guns. And as we entered, there were armed guards, and we were searched, even though we were in uniform.
I couldn't help but feel a little bitterness about the irony of having to visit my family, you know, behind barbed wires. It was a rather incongruous situation, to say the least.
When we saw that these are the things that the mainland boys were volunteering from, the fights all stopped. Yeah.
They have baseball tournaments between the service guys and then the people in our camp. And after games like that, we had chazuke party, rice balls, takuan.
Well, we were so happy to see people from home.
Girls from home.
Yeah, girls especially.
and we'd have dances for them, and we'd call ourselves Denson USO Girls. My, we were popular. Nah.
Yeah, I remember.
Uh-huh.
We were not only going to fight the enemy, but we had to fight another war, another a home front war. This very question of your loyalty, that we had to fight the battle of, you might say, misunderstanding and prejudice.
In a little over a year, the inexperienced soldiers of the 442nd completed training at Camp Shelby. Some of the men were recruited by the Military Intelligence Service and served in the Pacific. The other Japanese Americans would now leave U.S. soil for the gritty battlefields of the Allied front.
We landed in Europe after a long trip on, one of these Liberty ships. We were put into cattle cars and shipped over to the neighborhood of Naples. We got all our gear together in what they call a staging area, and went through some practice exercises, and then we joined the front.
Near the end of June 1944, the 442nd saw combat for the first time in Italy.
Now this was the 442nd Combat Team, plus the 100th Infantry, who had already been over there. They joined us as one of the battalions.
They were there, at least a year ahead of us, and they had already built up a tremendous reputation as Nisei soldiers.
In early June, the 100th Infantry had been attached to the U.S. Fifth Army under General Mark Clark and had played a major role in the Allied liberation of Rome.
And Rome actually was cleared by the 100th Infantry. They should have been given the honor of marching first American troops to march through Rome, but they were told to halt at the outskirts of Rome. And some other outfits came right by, walking through, to be the first Americans into Rome.
Our basic duties of the 522 Battalion was the direct support of the infantry.
Our forte was the so-called airburst drill. You see, the people in the foxholes, if you fired and you impacted on the ground, you almost had to have a direct hit. But what we had was a timed shell that required accurate measurement, where it would burst 50 feet or 75 feet up in the air, overlooking the foxholes. There was no safety there.
When we went through the area after, the front moved on, the dead bodies were still there, many of the Germans, and some of them crouched behind machine guns, with a clean hole right in the forehead. They didn't know what hit them,
The Nazis, when they're rounded up, are plenty surprised. Suspicious of their own propaganda, Hans believes he's gone to fight Japan, too. Fritz thinks that maybe these GIs are Chinese troops, recently transferred to the Italian front.
By the fall of 1944, any doubts regarding the loyalties of the Japanese Americans were dispelled. The Fifth Army's Mark Clark gave glowing reports to General Marshall. "If you've got any more," he said, "send them to me."
Your battalion has done a wonderful job in this Italian campaign. What are your reasons for fighting?
I'm fighting over here for the better things of life and to preserve the American way of living.
Lynn Crost, a journalist for the Honolulu Star Bulletin, reported on the heroics of the 442nd and 100th on the battlefields. But that was in Hawaii. On the mainland, though some articles and newsreels praised the AJA soldier, there was not much to counter the anti-Japanese propaganda blitz.
The Japanese are not easy to know. I've lived among them for 10 years, and I can testify that they are as different from ourselves as any people on this planet. The real difference is in their minds. You cannot measure Japanese sense of logic by any Western yardstick.
If the campaign against the Japanese began in earnest with the attack at Pearl Harbor, it cemented itself in the American mind with the ensuing barrage of hatred on film and in print. Few Americans chose to differentiate between the Japanese enemy and the Japanese shedding their American blood in the trenches of Italy and France.
One thing that certainly stands out in my mind about the 522nd in combat was our campaign in the Vosges Mountains when we were called on to rescue that lost battalion of the 36th Division, Texas 36th Division.
In the heat of battle, you know, many times the commanding general of the division would be right there on the front line. In fact, you know, the son of Sinclair Lewis, the writer, was his aide, and he got shot standing right next to the general.
This General Darquis came up there, and the general said, "Oh, there's no one out there." He said, you men are not pushing." He told the colonel, he said, men are not pushing enough. And the colonel said, "We're pushing all we can."
And one time, he called for artillery fire. He gave a set of coordinates. You know, I want you to lay fire right there, you know. And word got back to our fire direction center. They looked at that, and they questioned the general's orders. That's the location, you know, of the lost battalion. And if we had blindly followed orders, blaming the general for the orders, you know, and had laid fire at that exact coordinates, we would have wiped out the lost battalion. And just think what that would have meant, you know. Good race relations after that would have been impossible for the Americans of Japanese ancestry. We would have been on everybody's S list.
While we were up there, we went through mines, and also we were subject to cannon fire and mortar fire, a lot of mortar. The mortars come in and they hit those trees and they burst.
And Colonel Miller was pleading and in tears that we had lost too many men and that was impossible to advance. But the orders were that he had to. And the men were shooting from the hips, you know, just walking and firing their guns. And I saw these, the enemy coming up with their hands. What if they had known, the enemy had known that we had just few men and retaliated? I think we would have been wiped out. Why were we used to rescue the lost battalion? The Texas was a division, which is over 3 times the size of the 442nd Regiment. And this is why, after thinking, we must have been expendables.
Rescued at last after 6 days under incessant fire from an enemy on all sides, the 141st Regiment comes back. These men were without food or medicine for 4 days. They find there's nothing so good as field rations or a cigarette.
The combat team suffered heavy casualties during the fighting in the Vosges forests, losing over 4 times as many men as were rescued from the lost battalion of the Texas 36th. Decimated, the 100th 442nd was sent into the maritime Alps of southern France, patrolling German borders in what soldiers called the Champagne Campaign.
And that's when our unit split up. And the 442nd Regiment Infantry, they were called back to Italy to General Clark, the 5th Army, and it took a 522 Field Artillery and sent us north up into France and Germany to make the push into Germany.
Artillery was separated because we needed gunfire power to break through the Siegfried line.
We lined up there and we fired across that line by thousands. and just lit up the whole sky. You know, 105s were in the front and the big guns were in the back, and they were firing across.
The Germans were holding out there along that line before they crossed the Rhine, where there wasn't no stopping because they didn't have any defenses built up that they could hold.
In early March 1945, the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion crossed the Rhine, becoming the only Nisei unit to fight in the Allied campaign for Germany.
And the infantry unit was always behind us. They couldn't keep up with us. So we were very much by ourselves.
In fact, we were capturing them, you know. Artillery capturing enemy infantrymen is something very rare, you know, but it was a winning war by then. The Germans had nothing left.
In the last days of April, as the Third Reich collapsed, Allied forces swept through Germany with victory close at hand. But celebration would wait as the conscience of the world was challenged by the grim revelations of Hitler's final solution. 6 million Jews exterminated in Nazi concentration camps. The first such concentration camp was established for political prisoners at Dachau in 1933. Police Chief Heinrich Himmler had assured the people that protective custody would only be enforced as long as necessary. 12 years later, Dachau had come to signify the place where the SS state began, a model in terror and suffering that had led to mass extermination camps such as Auschwitz and Treblinka.
When I was liberated in Dachau, and the first or second day, well, I think it was first day, maybe somebody else come in, but I can swear the Japanese soldiers were there the same day. But who opened the gates first? Which battalion? A lot of people say this battalion, another battalion, but in the same day I seen Japanese descent people in American uniforms.
From the diary of Ichiro Imamura, 522nd Field Artillery Battalion. 2 liaison scouts from the 522nd Field Artillery were among the first Allied troops to release prisoners from the Dachau concentration camp. I watched as one of the scouts used his carbine to shoot off the chain that held the prison gates shut. He said he just had to open the gates when he saw a couple of the 50 or so prisoners sprawled on the snow-covered ground, moving weakly. They weren't dead as he had first thought.
There wasn't any guard at this gate where we broke into. We found several people on the ground, you know, in bad shape.
When we seen these prisoners, we wondered what they were locked up in there for. They were so thin and so frail looking that they couldn't do anything.
I remember going into this particular one, and of course, which of all the many Dachaus this one was, I'm not sure. See, these people were really walking skeletons already. Eyes were sunken, you know, and yet they were alert. These people were very alert, and I admired the fortitude they had in having survived all the terrific, you know, treatment they had.
Then we went a few yards or so, and then I noticed that they had this oven-like thing. I understand that later on that's what the incinerator where they put all the whoever was in the camp.
Of course, we had given orders not to feed them because we knew they couldn't hardly stand that kind of food because they were in such a bad condition.
We had a place designated for disposing of all of our food scraps, you know. It was a hole in the ground or some. And I also went over there to scrape off out of my mess kit, you know, all the leftovers. And there were 2 or 3 of these Dachau prisoners standing around, you know, and in their German asking, you know, Warum? Warum? Why are you throwing that food instead of giving it to us, you know?
There were so many people with striped clothes were out from the area, and there were many of the people were around the dead animal and eating the animal. And that scene I cannot forget.
And nobody told us anything. We just happened to drive by, like, you know, moving up into position. And all we could see was flat cars, several flat cars with the bodies piled up like cordwood.
A lot of them had starved to death and had been gassed, and they hadn't cremated, and it was in just corpses. They had just boxcar loads of corpses that when we found that they hadn't got rid of.
How can man treat another man this way? I don't understand it.
You get kind of frustrated or, you know, sad that those things happen. You kind of feel, I don't know, something in your heart that you want to pay back or something.
Army Signal Corps footage documents the U.S. 45th and 42nd Divisions entering Dachau. The Allies had passed on opportunities to end the killing, balking at pleas to bomb railways leading to the camp at Auschwitz. None of the camps were military objectives. And as the 522nd passed through Dachau, freed prisoners welcomed the Japanese Americans, just as freed people all over Europe welcomed their Allied liberators in the final days of war. For the men of the 522nd, the tremendous desire for liberty and the proving of loyalty in a suspicious climate had brought each soldier to this place, thrust into the role of liberators in defense of democracy and sharing a moment in history with the persecuted people of Europe.
Irony, you say, to see one persecuted minority volunteer in American Army and liberating another persecuted minority in Europe.
After several months of occupation duty in southern Germany, the 522nd returned home under the banner of the 442nd. For its size and length of service, the combat team, along with the 100th Infantry Battalion, was the most decorated unit in U.S. military history.
They were the best soldiers I've ever seen. Yeah, they were really good. And I'm not saying that just because I'm here with them. They've always known that I was felt a lot of them. They were good men.
The combat team paid in blood, fighting for the freedom of all people. Yet not until 1952 did Congress allow the Issei, or first generation of Japanese ancestry, to become U.S. citizens. And as Americans remembered the attack at Pearl Harbor 50 years later, feelings for God and country were mixed with those of pain, and a sometimes profound misunderstanding of what Americans had done to other Americans.
This ground embraces many American veterans whose love of country was put to the test unfairly by our own authorities. These and other natural-born American citizens faced wartime internment, and they committed no crime. They were sent to internment camps simply because their ancestors were Japanese.
In 1988, President Reagan signed legislation providing reparations of $20,000 to each qualified former internee of Japanese ancestry, as well as a formal apology from the government. Relatives of internees who died before the bill was signed received no compensation. Ignorance, as the lifeblood of prejudice, perpetuates itself today, nearly 50 years after one discriminated minority put country above all else, and nearly 50 years after the events in Europe led to the near annihilation of another.
people don't believe it. In fact, nowadays, there are some people who say that never happened, you know, but we saw it with our own eyes, these starving prisoners. You know. And I don't think any of us who saw it will ever forget it.